History will forever remember the moment 7,000 Greek soldiers met a force 40 times their size in a narrow mountain pass, changing the destiny of the West forever. Deep in the Thermopylae Pass of northern Greece, the ancient world braced itself for an overwhelming assault. They were about to face the largest military machine ever gathered up to that point. Close to 300,000 soldiers from the vast Persian Empire were advancing on the Greeks, the core of which was 300 of the world's most formidable fighters, the Spartans. The 300 men from Sparta were essentially the special forces unit of the ancient era. Their mission was to hold that bottleneck or perish in the attempt. For millennia, historians have celebrated the Spartans for their valor, adherence to principle, and the ultimate sacrifice at Thermopylae. Yet not one of them would survive this legendary final stand. Richard Gabriel. Thermopylae is one of the most recognized and iconic last stands in all of military history. Think of it as the Alamo of the ancient world. But Thermopylae is also remembered as the confrontation that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Western civilization and ultimately save the concept of democracy. In this rugged passage, a few stood against many, as 300 brave warriors prepared for their final, desperate battle. In 480 BC, King Xerxes, the absolute ruler of the immense Persian Empire, arrived in northeastern Greece. Xerxes commanded the entire Persian war apparatus, the largest fighting force in the ancient world. Richard Gabriel. The Persian army at the time was the biggest and most advanced military force globally. It was capable of fielding over 100,000 combat troops in a battle at any given moment. However, for this massive invasion, Xerxes is believed to have assembled an even greater host of soldiers. Modern scholarly analysis suggests the army was around 300,000 men strong, though some classical sources push that figure as high as 2 million, rivaling the total number of combatants at the Normandy D-Day landings. This was an army so vast no living Greek had ever seen anything like it traverse their country. Approximately 1,000 warships sailed alongside the enormous land army, protecting its flank. The Persian Empire was truly gargantuan. Its territory stretched from the Indus River in modern India all the way to the Nile River in Egypt. It was easily the largest empire the ancient world had ever witnessed, commanding vast, almost unimaginable resources. For 5 years leading up to this point, Xerxes had poured that incredible wealth into raising soldiers, building his fleet, and stockpiling enormous amounts of provisions and food for his ambitious invasion of Greece. His stated aim was to utterly destroy the Greek city-state of Athens. It's essential to pause and reflect on the staggering disparity in size between the two adversaries. First, you have Greece, with a modest population estimated at only 500,000 to 600,000 people. On the global stage, it was practically insignificant, an isolated, almost irrelevant backwater. Now, contrast that with the Persian Empire, a land of millions upon millions of diverse subjects, literally the greatest empire in the world at the time. The difference in scale is hard to grasp. It would be like every state in the modern United States simultaneously attacking a small island nation like Cuba, for instance. Some historical accounts suggest Xerxes was trying to conquer Athens simply to further expand his empire to the west. But other theories propose the invasion of Greece was primarily a punitive expedition designed to punish Athens for aiding a rebellion against Persian rule 25 years prior. Whatever Xerxes' precise motivations for this attack, the invasion occurred at a highly critical moment in Athenian history. The fledgling democracy, which forms one of the core fundamental pillars of Western civilization, was still extremely young. This overwhelming invasion threatened to extinguish it before it could even fully take root. Xerxes gathered his massive army in the Persian province of Lydia, located in modern-day Turkey, and began an 850-mile march, circling the Aegean Sea toward Greece. In August of 480 BC, his force arrived at a famously narrow gap in the mountains. This was Thermopylae, the historically vital location where the Greeks had chosen to make their defense, and where the pivotal 3-day battle would unfold. Most estimates suggest the pass at that time was only about 200 yards wide at its broadest point. To the south of the pass rose Mount Kallidromos, nearly 5,000 feet tall. The base of this mountain presented a sheer vertical cliff face of about 300 feet. To the north of the pass, a similar cliff face loomed directly over the Aegean Sea. Stephen Pressfield. Geographically speaking, Thermopylae is a naturally occurring bottleneck separating northern Greece from the mainland to the south, where all the major Greek cities were located. There simply was no other practical route for a massive army to travel from the north to the south. Therefore, Leonidas, the Spartans, and all the allied Greeks knew that this was the sole location where an effective stand could be made. Xerxes ordered a scout into the pass to report what opposition lay in the path of Persia's advance toward Athens. The scout soon discovered 7,000 Greek soldiers resolutely blocking the eastern entrance of the pass. The Persians outnumbered the Greeks by a staggering 50-to-1 ratio. However, despite their dramatically inferior numbers, the Greeks had chosen their position brilliantly, allowing them a chance to withstand the immense Persian onslaught. In a masterstroke of strategy, the Greeks had completely neutralized the Persian numerical superiority by selecting Thermopylae as the killing ground. If you visualize the Battle of Thermopylae from an aerial perspective, what you see is a narrow canyon through which the entire land army is forced to advance. That narrowness played directly into the Greek advantage because it allowed a small contingent of men to narrow the front of the battle and establish a significant defensive position. The natural choke point turned the very strength of the huge Persian army into a weakness. Its overwhelming size became a critical liability because every soldier had to be funneled through the tight pass. Thus, a smaller force with superior discipline and flexibility could effectively defend against far larger numbers. The combined Greek fighting force gathered here was unprecedented, marking the first time in their long history that the various Greek city-states fought together in unity rather than against each other. Greece at this point was not yet a unified nation. It was a fragmented collection of small, fiercely independent city-states that constantly skirmished over regional dominance. The two largest and most powerful city-states, Athens and Sparta, were notoriously bitter rivals. But at Thermopylae, they chose to put aside their deep-seated differences and unite to fight the common Persian enemy.
Leading this entire Greek coalition army was the renowned Spartan king and future hero of Thermopylae, Leonidas.
Leonidas held one of the two kingships in Sparta, and he was the man chosen by all the allied Greek forces, all the various city-states, to go and maintain the defense of the Thermopylae Pass. He personally selected the troops who would accompany him and was the overall general in command. His job was to hold the line no matter the cost, even to the very last man.
The final stand at Thermopylae would elevate Leonidas into the realm of legend. From that time forward, every Greek citizen would know his name and the heroic actions he and his 300 Spartans performed at Thermopylae. A Persian military advisor reported the Spartan-led defense to Xerxes. The exchange is famously documented by the ancient Greek historian Herodotus in his seminal work, The Histories, which provides one of the earliest accounts of Thermopylae. "Pay attention to my warning. These men have come to challenge us for this pass and are preparing themselves as required for battle. If you manage to crush these specific troops and then subdue the remaining army that stands behind them in Sparta, there is no other nation on earth, O king, that will dare to raise their arms against you." But Xerxes was not relying solely on his massive army to defeat Leonidas and the Spartan-led land defense. Just off the coast of Thermopylae, in a narrow body of water called the Artemisium Strait, the mighty Persian navy lay in wait. Their plan was to sail around Leonidas's position and surround the Greek land forces from behind. If the Persian navy successfully breached the Artemisium Strait, then Xerxes' primary force would attack the Greeks from the front, while the land troops landed in the rear would catch them in a devastating pincer movement. So for the Greeks to hold at Thermopylae, it was absolutely essential to simultaneously halt the advance of the Persian navy at Artemisium. To block the Persian naval force, a fleet of 200 Greek warships prepared to defend the narrow strait. Aboard the Athenian flagship was the Greek military commander Themistocles, an Athenian politician widely credited as the architect of the combined Greek land and sea defense against the Persians. If either Themistocles at sea or Leonidas on land failed in their mission, tens of thousands of Athenians would undoubtedly perish, and the remaining Greek city-states faced the grim prospect of complete enslavement. The final stage was set. The combatants were in position. The decisive moment of history was about to begin. Xerxes launched the first blow. From roughly 150 yards away from the Greek lines, thousands of Persian archers let loose a barrage of arrows. Leonidas and the Spartans had trained their entire lives for this moment, as Spartans were quite literally bred for warfare. Around 530 BC, approximately 50 years before the famous battle at Thermopylae, Leonidas was born and faced the very first trial of his destined military life. A Spartan elder carefully examined the newborn Leonidas for any signs of defect. Immediately after a child was delivered, the state's first action was to inspect the infant and determine, are you physically fit or are you unfit to live within this society? This was an exceptionally demanding warrior society. They could not tolerate any individual who might be considered a weakling or who could become a weak link in their system. If an infant showed even the slightest imperfection, they were not permitted to live. The child would be, quote, exposed. That is, the infant was carried to a sacred, desolate hillside and simply left there to die. The feelings of the parents were entirely disregarded. The only thing that mattered was the child's potential benefit to the state. Only two categories of people in the Spartan state were allowed to have a tombstone engraved with their name: a man who fell in battle and a woman who died during childbirth. This was because both actions were considered to be the ultimate self-sacrifice for the state. Now, if you take a moment to consider that philosophy, childbearing and child-rearing were seen as being for the benefit of the state, not the individual family, and certainly not the individual child. While strong babies like Leonidas were spared, many others in this warrior cult were left to perish. The Spartans firmly believed that these rejected infants would likely never survive the grueling, unique Spartan training regimen, a process designed to turn ordinary boys into ruthlessly effective killing machines. The Greek historian Herodotus records that at the age of 7, every Spartan boy, including young Leonidas, was forcibly separated from his family and placed into state-run military camps. The daily life of a young Spartan boy would be considered extremely harsh by modern standards. Up until about age 7, the boy remained mostly with his mother. His father would visit occasionally, and the boy would live a relatively normal childhood. At that decisive point, he was taken into a regimented state education system. There, they were subjected to a brutal, rough military existence. In these camps, young Leonidas would live, train, and learn the essential skills needed to kill. Once a young boy was taken away from his mother at age 7 and began his Spartan upbringing, he did nothing but train continuously for the next 12 years until he was finally ready to join the army. Fight! Richard Gabriel. Their education focused relentlessly on developing military capabilities, iron discipline, and extreme physical toughness. They were intentionally kept underfed, often hungry at all times. This constant hunger was meant to encourage them to steal food in order to survive. David George, you were strictly trained not to shed tears. You were taught to conceal all expressions of pain. Their entire societal structure was designed to systematically strip away any sense of individual identity. Matthew Gonzalez. Another very unusual and brutal ritual they practiced to ensure their men were tough was that they would be publicly flogged in groups until they bled profusely. Whoever could endure the longest and remain standing was tremendously honored. The boys' families would stand nearby, screaming and urging the boys, "Do not pass out! Do not pass out!" There appears to be evidence that the level of violence increased significantly as the boys grew older. One can only assume this intensity was aimed at preparing them for the ultimate experience of battle, where they would be surrounded by blood, gore, and dead bodies. David George. In certain respects, one might view the Spartans as a highly dysfunctional fraternity, where the hazing and other elements of group life went radically wrong. As the boys matured, the military training became increasingly intense and violent. Bring honor to your family. Bring honor to your Spartan lineage. You must become strong or you will die. Push, Spartan, push harder. By the time Leonidas and the Spartan boys reached their early teens, actual weapons such as wooden swords and spears with blunted tips were introduced into the military training exercises. Yet even during these war games, the potential consequences were deadly. Matthew Gonzalez. Youths were sometimes killed during the course of this brutal fighting. It was all considered necessary preparation. You were forced to witness your comrades and fellow youths being killed. One of the final tests for all young Spartans was also one of the most savage, the Plataea. Leonidas had to sneak out of his barracks under the cover of darkness and murder a local slave, known as a helot. Take a moment to fully grasp the significance of this. Every culture throughout history has its own version of a male rite of passage, a ritual that marks the boy's transformation into a man. In Spartan society, you were not considered a man until you had choked another human being to death. A boy became a man when he choked another to death. This grim practice of killing a helot was already centuries old by the time Leonidas was ready to achieve manhood. The crucial element of this ritual, however, was not the murder itself. David George. What was strictly forbidden was getting caught in the act of the murder. You would be severely punished for being discovered. The true purpose of the institution was to train you in the art of evasion, the art of being a truly effective soldier, and the art of stealth. By the time Leonidas reached the age of 18, his entire education was complete. He had successfully survived the relentless Spartan training designed to eliminate any sign of weakness. He had mastered the ability to kill or be killed. He and the surviving young men were then formally inducted into the army.
For Spartan parents, this marked one of the proudest and most significant moments of their lives. It represented the complete transformation of their son from a mere child into a full-fledged man. This was especially true for mothers, as it fully validated the sacrifice they had made for the state. She had sent her child away at the tender age of 7 to become a warrior, and now, at 18, she was sending him off to fight in battle. One of the most famous and illustrative stories is of a Spartan mother seeing her son off to war. As she handed him his heavy shield, she would tell him, in Greek, "with this shield" or "on it." This meant either return victorious, carrying your shield, or return as a corpse, carried upon it. Essentially, it was a demand: you must win the battle or you must die trying. Spartan mothers were proponents of the most extreme version of tough love. In this unique Spartan warrior cult, the women were also celebrated for their physical strength and independence. On occasion, a confident man might try to forcibly take a wife, but if the man was not to her liking and she possessed enough strength to successfully fend him off, the man would fail and be rejected. If the Spartan male was a proven, attractive warrior, like Leonidas, he would succeed in winning a wife. But domestic life for a Spartan soldier was anything but ordinary, as they were almost perpetually away on the battlefield. The Spartans were genuinely the first truly professional soldiers among the various Greek city-states. Every single summer was dedicated to warfare. The Greek city-states would march over whatever mountain pass separated them from the next town. They would essentially spend the summer violently attacking each other.
The soldiers kept their swords and their spears hanging over the fireplace. Their shield was always ready. They would grab them and head out to fight each other mercilessly. It seems that the constant regional conflicts that Leonidas participated in were merely preparation for the ultimate confrontation looming on the horizon against the Persians at Thermopylae. In 481 BC, 1 year before the Battle of Thermopylae, a Greek intelligence agent discovered that the Persian king Xerxes was mobilizing his immense army. It was a force many believed to be close to 300,000 strong. To a Greek observing this massive mobilization, it would have appeared as if the entire world was descending upon them to consume them. The sheer numbers would have been overwhelming, easily in the hundreds of thousands. It genuinely would have felt like the end of the world was at hand. Xerxes' objective was to march directly to the Greek city-state of Athens and burn it to the ground. When the Athenians learned of Xerxes' plan and the gigantic force he had assembled, they quickly realized they desperately needed assistance. So they sent out a general call to all their allied states, urging them to come and defend Greece as a whole. But the urgent plea was largely ignored. The reason for this indifference was that no one yet shared a common concept of what Greece as a unified nation truly was. Remember, what we now consider Greece was then nothing more than a disparate collection of city-states that spent more time fighting each other than uniting. Despite their historically poor relationship, the Athenians reached out to one of their most significant regional rivals for urgent help, the Spartans, led by their king, Leonidas. By this point in his life, Leonidas was a highly experienced and seasoned military leader. Recall that he had spent his entire boyhood enduring the severe training regimen all Spartan boys underwent to become hardened, ruthless fighters. Now he was one of the 2 kings of Sparta, so when the Athenians came begging for help, they weren't foolish. Leonidas was a truly exceptional warrior. However, for Leonidas personally, this direct request from the Athenians was destined to seal his fate. Before making any decision to assist the Athenians, the Spartans felt compelled to consult a religious oracle. The Spartans were an intensely devout people. One of their traditional ways of discerning the will of the gods was through oracles, and they held the oracle at Delphi in the highest esteem. Dating back to around 1400 BC, the oracle at Delphi was one of the most sacred and revered Greek shrines. Located in a temple built over a deep fissure in the earth, the oracle would respond to seekers by entering a profound trance-like state. Some theories propose that ethylene vapors naturally rising from the intersection of 3 major geological fault lines deep beneath the temple might have caused the oracle's altered state and strange behavior. Modern scientific analysis, however, has examined the geology beneath the temple, and all studies to date have been inconclusive. When the crucial question was posed to her by one of the accompanying priests, the oracle would typically utter something largely intelligible. The priest would then interpret her response and deliver it to the person who had asked the original question. O men of Sparta, be warned, either your glorious city will fall to the sons of Persia, or all of Sparta must grieve for the loss of a king as a sacrifice, a king, a direct descendant of great Heracles. Leonidas, who believed he was a descendant of the legendary hero Heracles, immediately interpreted this to mean that the gods had specifically chosen him to save Sparta through his own death. He informed the Spartan elders that he would agree to help the Athenians confront the Persians. Leonidas became convinced the oracle's prophecy referred directly to him. His death, his willing sacrifice, would guarantee the salvation of Sparta. Leonidas's decision took on a mythical significance. However, there may have been a more pragmatic military reason why Leonidas decided to go into battle. Regardless of whether Xerxes genuinely intended to occupy Greece permanently or not, in the minds of the Spartans, the threat was very real and immediate. Therefore, the principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend applied, so they decided to join forces with the Athenians. Furthermore, if the Greeks were going to mount a combined land and sea defense against the Persians, it made logical sense to have the most highly skilled soldiers in all of Greece lead the effort. Still, the conservative Spartan council was not completely convinced and only authorized Leonidas to take a minimal force, a mere 300. I am certain that when the 300 were chosen, the other Spartans, there were approximately 9,000 others in the army, felt that they were being excluded from an incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This was the exact mission they were born and trained to fulfill, and they knew that the ultimate sacrifice would guarantee immortality for themselves, their families, and their children, not to mention, of course, the monumental act of saving all of Greece. Leonidas handpicked his absolute finest warriors, but he insisted that only those who had already fathered sons could join, ensuring that their family bloodline would survive their inevitable deaths. Did Leonidas believe this was a suicide mission from the beginning? Perhaps, perhaps not. What he certainly understood was that it presented a tremendous opportunity for an intense, epic military confrontation and a chance for unparalleled Spartan and personal glory, which was always the core motivation for the Spartans.
The challenge facing Leonidas was overwhelming. He was about to confront the world's most formidable fighting force, a relentless war machine that had successfully dominated the known world for nearly a full century, the mighty Persian Empire. In 549 BC, about 70 years before the heroic last stand at Thermopylae, Cyrus the Great successfully unified all the various tribes inhabiting what is now central Iran. He erupted from the mountains with a sophisticated army composed of light and heavy infantry, as well as highly effective cavalry units. It was Cyrus who first recognized the decisive importance of horse-mounted combat, and by integrating horse-borne tribes into his ranks, he established the long-standing tradition of highly mobile cavalry within the Persian army. When a Persian army took the field, it was typically structured with about 80% infantry and a crucial 20% cavalry. This devastating combination made the Persians virtually unstoppable on the open plains of Asia. As the infantry forces engaged the enemy's front line, the cavalry would execute flanking maneuvers, causing the enemy formation to quickly crumble. Over a period of 20 years, Cyrus managed to conquer 4 major kingdoms across Asia: Media, Lycia, Lydia, and finally, in 539 BC, he toppled the powerful kingdom of Babylonia. Cyrus now ruled a vast empire that extended from the borders of India all the way to Egypt. The Persian Empire was the largest and most successful imperial entity in the long history of Near Eastern empires. They were unquestionably the dominant global superpower. Cyrus organized his massive empire into smaller administrative provinces called satrapies. Instead of forcing the conquered peoples to adopt Persian customs and beliefs, Cyrus generally permitted them to govern themselves and freely practice their own religions. While subjects were required to pay taxes to the central government, generally speaking, they were allowed to maintain their own traditional ways of life. There was no concerted effort to impose a single religion or even a single uniform set of civic laws. Cyrus is viewed by many historical figures as a liberator rather than a conqueror. This type of relatively compassionate governing behavior was almost unheard of in the cutthroat ancient world. Yet, ironically, this policy may have inadvertently set the stage for the Spartan last stand at Thermopylae. In 546 BC, Cyrus conquered the Greek colonies located in the province of Ionia, in modern-day Turkey. True to his established policy, he allowed the local Greek governors to remain in power. But approximately 50 years later, in 499 BC, the Greek colonists openly revolted against Persian rule. So the Persians, in their attempt to do the right thing by supporting the established local government, ultimately ended up alienating the local population. That resulted in a major uprising known as the Ionian Revolt. The Persian king at this time was Darius, Cyrus's great-grandson.
Initially, Darius allowed the local governors to handle the uprising, but the Greek rebels were about to receive unexpected outside assistance. Richard Gabriel. When Ionia escalated into a full-scale revolt against the Persians, they urgently called upon their mother country, Athens, for military support. The Athenians then made what was arguably their most profound strategic error in a century. They dispatched troops to assist the Ionian rebels. With crucial Athenian support, the rebels succeeded in burning Sardis, the capital city of Ionia, completely to the ground. Herodotus wrote a detailed account of the rebellion. Almost instantly, the flames began to spread rapidly from house to house until the entire town was engulfed in fire. Thus, Sardis was utterly destroyed by fire. Among its ruins was a temple dedicated to a local native goddess. When the Persians later saw this temple in ruins, they would use it as a justification for subsequently burning Greek temples during their invasion. The Ionian Revolt proved to be an incredibly significant event in the history of Greek and Persian relations because it established the root cause for what would follow over the next 80 years and eventually escalate into open conflict between Athens and Persia, a conflict that had never existed before. Athens had just awakened a sleeping giant. King Darius was absolutely determined to exact revenge. Stephen Pressfield. This act thoroughly infuriated Darius. He reportedly instructed one of his servants at every single meal before he took his first bite of food and whisper into his ear, "Sire, remember the Athenians." So Darius had solemnly vowed that he would make these people pay for their insolence. Greek soil was about to be drenched in blood. In 490 BC, 10 years prior to the Spartan last stand at Thermopylae, the Persian king Darius dispatched a massive force of 30,000 soldiers across the Aegean Sea with the express purpose of annihilating Athens. The stated reason for the invasion was King Darius's fury. Years earlier, the Athenians had helped a group of Greek rebels burn a major Persian city to the ground, the Ionian Revolt. Now it was time for retribution, which would lead to one of the most famous and defining battles in Greek history, the Battle of Marathon. Approximately 26 miles east of Athens, on the plain of Marathon, a Greek army numbering about 8,000 men marched toward the coast to meet the advancing invaders. Richard Gabriel. The Greeks spotted the large Persian fleet offshore transporting troops to commence the attack on Athens. They immediately deployed their forces on the beach, presenting the Persians with the threat of a pitched battle. The Persians took the bait and began to unload their soldiers. 30,000 Persians poured off their ships and aggressively charged the waiting Greeks. The Greek forces had strategically formed a defensive line in a narrow valley situated between two mountains. The colossal Persian force slammed into the Athenian line. The Greeks held their ground initially, but soon the center of their defensive formation began to give way. The Persians eagerly pushed forward into the gap, but this was a deliberately executed trap. While the center of the Greek line appeared to be retreating, the flanks remained rock solid. As the Persians pressed further into the narrow valley, the Greek army's wings swiftly enveloped them. The Greeks had lured the Persians in expertly, and now they had them completely surrounded on three sides. The Persians were unable to maneuver effectively within the tight space, creating a confined, inescapable combat box. The resulting battle quickly turned into an absolute massacre. The surviving Persians rapidly retreated back towards the beach. The Greek commanders then decided to risk everything on a final decisive push. Richard Gabriel. The Greek heavy infantry smashed into what few Persian forces remained, driving them back towards the beach. The Persians frantically scrambled to get back on board their transport boats. As they attempted to board, they were mercilessly slaughtered by the Greek infantry. Accounts describe instances where Persians, desperately clinging to the sides of the boats, had their hands violently chopped off by the relentless Greeks. Following the great victory, the Greeks dispatched a dedicated runner back to Athens to report the triumph. The messenger covered a distance of about 26 miles, which is why today the modern marathon race is standardized at 26 miles. What is often left out of the popular story is that the runner who arrived in the central square of Athens shouted Nike, meaning victory, and then immediately collapsed and died from total exhaustion.
The Spartans typically fought in platoons arranged 8 men across and 4 men deep, standing shoulder to shoulder. Each man was positioned so he was partially shielded by the soldier's shield immediately to his right. This created a solid, continuous wall of shields in the front. It became essentially a massive, immovable barrier of bronze, wood, and muscle, standing firm and glistening in the sunlight. All Greek soldiers involved in the fighting were heavy infantry known as hoplites, a name derived from the large round shield they carried, called the hoplon. This shield was constructed from a concave piece of wood covered with a thin sheet of bronze, measured about 3 feet in diameter and weighed up to 20 pounds. The design included a new type of hand grip which emerged around the 6th century BC, known as the Argive grip. This innovation completely revolutionized ancient warfare. Earlier shields were held by a single handle positioned in the center. With the Argive shield, the soldier inserted his arm through a leather loop in the middle and gripped a handle situated near the rim, providing him with far greater leverage and control. So you held the end of the shield while the center was secured by the arm. If you consider the potential force you could exert with that shield configuration, significantly more power could be applied to hold the line. The Spartans were famous for painting distinctive personal symbols on the face of their shield. There is a story told of a Spartan warrior who had a life-sized image of a simple fly painted on his shield. When his comrades questioned him about it, he replied that he would get so close to the enemy that the fly would look as large and fearsome as a lion. King Xerxes made good on his promise to darken the sky. He ordered nearly 5,000 archers to launch their projectiles. Xerxes' archers were tribesmen drawn from all corners of his vast empire. They typically supplied their own bows, which were often made from date palm wood, a cheaper, inferior material that significantly diminished the bow's overall firing power. The arrows, loosed from over a football field away, struggled to penetrate the hoplites' heavy armor and dense shield. The arrows were largely deflecting off the shields, bouncing harmlessly off the helmets, and doing almost no real damage. This was mainly because, unless an arrow struck a man directly in the eye, there was practically no unprotected point for an arrow to penetrate. In addition to his massive shield, the hoplite's distinctive Corinthian helmet provided crucial protection from the continuous barrage of Persian arrows. This helmet originated in Greece around the 7th century BC. Constructed from a single piece of heavy bronze, the helmet offered maximum protection for the hoplite's head. However, these helmets were heavy, weighing about 10 pounds, and severely restricted the soldier's peripheral vision and hearing. While most helmets were decorated with a horsehair crest running from front to back, Spartan officers like Leonidas would have worn a helmet with the crest running side to side, distinguishing them as commanders. Most historians believe that the Spartans likely wore a bronze cuirass for full torso protection. Most hoplites of the time, however, wore sophisticated lamellar armor. Its strength came from its layered construction, created by gluing multiple strips of heavy linen fabric, leather, and thin bronze plates together. This lamellar armor effectively formed a type of ancient Kevlar equivalent. Incredibly, multiple layers of linen and leather could successfully withstand a spear thrust. It was designed to prevent a spear or arrow from penetrating the torso. Abandoning the ineffective missile attack, 10,000 Persian light infantrymen charged toward the Greek position. Over 1,000,000 pounds of muscle, bronze, and wood were moments away from violently colliding in the narrow Thermopylae pass. Inevitably, this huge mass of men smashed headlong into the Greek phalanx, and the Greek lines simply did not budge. The formation was too heavy.
It was too dense. The sustained pressure from the ranks behind held the front line rigidly in place. The Greeks successfully halted the crushing Persian charge. Now they instantly transitioned to the offensive. Fighting within their perfectly disciplined phalanx, the front two lines executed a coordinated spear attack, striking both from above and below the shield wall. The hoplites' primary weapon was the dory, a long spear measuring between 6 and 9 feet in length. Approximately 2 inches in diameter, the 2 to 4 pound dory was tipped with a lethal iron spearhead. At the back of the spear was an iron butt plate, which provided essential balance and also served as a secondary short-range killing weapon for the hoplite. In the initial clash, spears descended from above and spears thrust up from underneath the shield wall. The screams and the flow of blood were everywhere instantly. That first engagement likely resulted in 1,000 men killed, and the majority of the wounds inflicted would have been instantly fatal, delivered to the chest or face. The hoplite's secondary weapon was the xephos, a 2 to 3 foot long double-edged iron straight sword designed specifically for thrusting and hacking at the enemy in close combat. However, the Greeks only used this if they had lost their primary spear or if the phalanx formation had broken rank, which happened extremely rarely. The ferocious fighting continued on and off for the majority of the first day. What typically occurred was what we call battle pulses. The two opposing sides would fiercely hack and slam into each other for a brief period, sometimes only 10 to 20 seconds, and then they would briefly disengage. One side might fall back slightly, and the other side would cautiously move forward again. So it was not a continuous, unbroken experience of combat. It simply could not function that way for long periods. The Persians were easy targets for the well-armored Greeks. They wore very little or no protective armor and carried only flimsy shields made of wicker. The Persian light infantry were fundamentally unsuited for this specific type of battle. They were engineered for speed, designed to attack disorganized tribal armies across the open plains of Asia. Trapped in the narrow pass, the Persians were completely unable to maneuver. Crucially, they were also unable to utilize their highly effective cavalry. The extreme steepness of Mount Kallidromos on one side and the immediate presence of the Aegean Sea on the other made a Persian cavalry flanking maneuver utterly impossible. If you analyze the two most studied Greek battles, Marathon and Thermopylae, what becomes clear is the sheer genius of the Greek commanders in choosing terrain where the Persians could not bring their cavalry to bear. At Marathon, they never managed to get the horses off the ships. Even if they had, it would have made no difference because the Greeks had wedged themselves into a tight, narrow front. The same strategic reality applied at Thermopylae. Their cavalry would have been totally useless. With every renewed battle pulse, more and more Persians were mercilessly slaughtered. There was no concept of surrender or mercy, only death. Stephen Pressfield. The first day was sheer carnage. The Spartans formed up shoulder to shoulder, solid as a massive rock, and allowed the relentless waves of Persians to simply crash and break upon them. The Persians slowly began to realize that it was a terrible mistake to launch wave after wave against these men, each of whom possessed the equivalent of our very best modern special forces training. As the first day drew to a close, the 300 Spartans and their Greek allies systematically eliminated any remaining Persian forces. Richard Gabriel. Leonidas perfectly understood the tactical situation. After the first full day of fighting, he must have realized, I have achieved exactly what I set out to do. I am successfully holding up one of the largest land armies ever deployed to attack Greece. I have them completely funneled right here, and so far they can do nothing to stop me. But simultaneously with the land battle, the Persians were attempting to gain access to the rear of the Greek defenses via the sea. A massive naval confrontation between the Greeks and Persians was raging and bloodying the Artemisium Strait. In the Thermopylae Pass, the mighty King Leonidas and his Spartan warriors were successfully repelling the attack by the Persian light infantry. At the very same time, off the coast of Thermopylae in the Artemisium Strait, a decisive clash between the Persian and Greek navies was about to erupt. If you consider the Battle of Thermopylae in purely strategic terms, anyone with a military mind would immediately ask, yes, the Spartans can hold the line here, but what about the sea? What about the ocean flank? Why couldn't Xerxes simply land troops behind them using his ships? He commanded a huge armada of 1,000 warships.
The Athenians later constructed the original Parthenon temple to publicly commemorate the famous victory at Marathon over the Persians. The building itself and the battle's outcome sent powerful shockwaves reverberating throughout the entire Persian Empire. There's no doubt that a great empire like Persia, led by a powerful king, could not allow a direct insult to its national prestige to stand. That's precisely what the stinging defeat at Marathon represented. It effectively communicated to everyone watching, look at this small, seemingly insignificant power successfully stood up to this massive giant. Persia's first major attempt at revenge against Athens had failed spectacularly. Darius immediately began planning a second, even larger attack, but tragically died before the new invasion could be launched. The responsibility for executing Persian vengeance then fell to Darius's son, Xerxes. One of the fascinating aspects of the monarchs of the ancient world, whether you look at rulers in Egypt, Syria, or Persia, is that they meticulously groomed their sons to become warrior kings by giving them a comprehensive education. While Xerxes undoubtedly spent significant time in academic pursuits, studying philosophy, mathematics, and complex military tactics, he was also systematically taught how to fight his way out of the most extreme life-or-death confrontations. He was placed in a walled courtyard. The boy stood there while a live, ferocious lion was released into the courtyard with him. The command was simple: kill the lion or be killed by it. Xerxes' privileged background and rigorous training helped to fully prepare him to rule the world's largest and most dominant empire. But Xerxes held only one singular goal in his mind when he ascended to the kingship: absolute revenge against Athens. For a full decade, he meticulously planned his massive offensive. Xerxes was not a simpleton or a naive youth. He was a man born into royalty, educated thoroughly as both a ruthless warrior and a capable ruler. And he was a good ruler overall. No one, absolutely no one, except perhaps in the West, holds anything against him, apart from his attempt to burn Athens. What a terrible thing to do, indeed. In 481 BC, when the Greek spy uncovered Xerxes' invasion blueprint, he saw not just an immense army, he saw a people who possessed a technological superiority far beyond the Greeks. King Xerxes was preparing to achieve the seemingly impossible. He was going to march his army across water. Xerxes intended to move his army of 300,000 men across the Hellespont, a crucial mile-wide waterway that connects Asia to Europe, just south of the Black Sea. If they were to undertake this journey entirely by land, they would have been forced to walk all the way around the Black Sea, which would have added approximately 2 years to their march and required them to conquer a whole other set of hostile populations. To successfully transport his colossal force across the Hellespont, Xerxes commanded his engineers to construct a mile-long pontoon bridge assembled from hundreds of retired transport ships. At the time this construction was underway, there was a rapid shift occurring in naval ship design. Newer, more advanced vessels were entering service. This meant that plenty of older, used cargo ships were readily available at low prices. These ships were simply purchased and then strung together in a continuous line. Xerxes' brilliant engineers aligned nearly 700 ships side by side. They likely used heavy boulders to anchor each ship securely to the seabed from both the bow and the stern.
They then lashed the ships together using two different types of specialized heavy cables, one made from flax or heavy linen fiber, and the other meticulously crafted from papyrus. When we typically think of papyrus, we usually associate it with paper. However, the Egyptians had developed a method to convert the sticky core of the papyrus plant, called the pith, into an incredibly strong, durable rope. And this is exactly what Xerxes' engineers used to tether the ships together, the strong papyrus rope and the linen ropes. This cable technology represented the high-tech component of the entire operation, these incredibly long cables that stretched over a full mile. Dozens of these massive cable sections, each weighing nearly 2 tons, were used to secure the pontoons together and were anchored firmly to either shore. The Persians then laid wooden planks across the rails of each ship to create a perfectly flat surface over which men, horses, and baggage animals could march. It was an astonishing feat of engineering, and it must have once again given the waiting Greeks on the other side serious pause. Because this was not just a people who possessed a large army, this was a people who clearly understood the complex principles of advanced civil engineering. The Persian army successfully crossed the bridge and commenced their long march around the Aegean Sea. Almost 3 months later, Xerxes and his Persian force of 300,000 men arrived in northern Greece. Thanks to the advance warning provided by the Athenian spy, the Greek coalition had already established 2 distinct lines of defense. The primary line was located in the southern part of the peninsula, at the Isthmus of Corinth, intended to defend the major city-states on the Peloponnese, including Sparta itself. The secondary line was the forward defense team, positioned in the north at the Thermopylae Pass. Here, the Spartan king Leonidas was leading a coalition army comprised of his 300 elite Spartan warriors and approximately 7,000 soldiers drawn from other allied Greek city-states. Off the coast, the Athenian general Themistocles was commanding the Greek navy, preparing to engage the massive Persian fleet in the narrow Artemisium Strait. The decisive Battle of Thermopylae was finally at hand. Standing on a cliff overlooking the Thermopylae Pass in northeastern Greece, King Xerxes of Persia was finally prepared to commit his army to battle. Xerxes marched nearly 300,000 men, escorted by a fleet of 1,000 warships, all the way around the Aegean Sea, with the singular goal of destroying the Greek city-state of Athens. Waiting in the Thermopylae Pass was the Spartan king Leonidas with his contingent of approximately 7,000 Greek soldiers. They completely blocked the eastern side of the pass, defending the only viable route leading to Athens. In a brilliant strategic move, they had chosen Thermopylae as the battleground because the terrain completely nullified the massive Persian numerical superiority. Mountain passes are truly remarkable geographical features. One might ask, for instance, why has a nation like Switzerland never been successfully invaded? The answer lies in its mountain passes. A single determined man with a modern rifle can hold up an entire army division if the pass is narrow enough. In the ancient world, you could not effectively fight with more soldiers than you could physically bring to bear on the front line. So if you could shrink that front to only a few hundred men or even a few dozen, then a small number of troops could effectively hold back 100,000 men. As was customary in the ancient world before hostilities began, Xerxes first attempted to negotiate with Leonidas. He sent a messenger with a demand, stating, "You are severely outnumbered. You are confronting the greatest army on earth. Do not be foolish. Lay down your weapons and you will be permitted to live. Otherwise, you are all doomed to die." Leonidas, naturally, did not take kindly to this threat. This exchange led to the most famous line recorded by Herodotus. The Persian messenger then warned, "Be prepared to die. Our arrows will be so numerous they will literally block out the sun." To which Dionysius, Leonidas's courageous lieutenant, famously retorted, "Then we shall have our battle in the shade." That single quote perfectly encapsulated the entire spirit and nature of the coming battle. The Spartans were renowned as the best, toughest, and most disciplined soldiers in all of Greece. The 300 Spartans hand-selected for Thermopylae were indeed the Delta Force equivalent of the ancient world. Their sacred duty was to hold that pass or to die attempting it. Leonidas and his warriors deployed into their standard, highly effective fighting formation, the phalanx.
The answer was the Athenian navy. They were strategically positioned at Artemisium, while the Persians were based across the strait at Apheti. The Persian objective was to breach the Greek line, sail south through the narrow 6-mile-wide Artemisium Strait, and land soldiers behind Leonidas and his Greek warriors, completely encircling them. The man entrusted with the vital task of stopping the massive Persian fleet was aboard the Athenian flagship. He is considered by many to be the tactical genius behind the combined land and sea defense against the Persians, and is widely regarded as one of the ancient world's most brilliant military strategists. He was the Athenian Themistocles. When most people recall the Battle of Thermopylae, they instantly think of the 300 Spartans, or King Leonidas. But in reality, the unsung hero of the entire operation, the man who made the defense possible, was Themistocles. Themistocles, in many ways, served as the Winston Churchill of his generation. He was an astute Athenian politician with incredible foresight regarding the approaching conflict and a deep military thinker. He knew that the Persians were coming and that the Greeks were unprepared, but the Athenians simply did not believe him. The Persian navy attempted a complex maneuver to surround the smaller Greek fleet. They dispatched 200 of their 1,000 ships sailing southeast around the massive island of Euboea. By sending ships around Euboea, the Persian naval commander was attempting to avoid wasting his resources on a direct frontal assault. He calculated that the Greeks were not foolish enough to attack him head-on, so he planned to wait at his base until his smaller flanking force sailed around the island and successfully surrounded the Greek fleet. But Themistocles executed a bold and audacious move that completely surprised the Persian commander. Late in the afternoon, the Greek fleet sailed out from their base and deliberately provoked the Persian fleet, which was nearly 6 times their size. This aggressive move astonished the Persian commander. It was one thing for Themistocles to possess the audacity to attack the mighty Persian navy, but he was also completely surprised by the timing of the attack. It was late in the afternoon. By starting the battle in the late afternoon, Themistocles knew the fighting would soon have to cease because they would run out of daylight. You simply cannot fight a complex naval battle effectively in the dark. Thus, Themistocles was aiming to minimize his potential losses should the battle turn against him by relying on nightfall to end the engagement. The Persian commander ordered his remaining 800 ships to advance into the strait. Despite the severe numerical disadvantage, Themistocles and the Greek fleet fiercely attacked the Persian ships, attempting to sink them in a ferocious assault. The central objective of the battle was to sink the enemy ship, either by ramming her squarely in the side or by smashing off all her oars and rendering her completely immobile. The Greeks certainly faced an immense uphill struggle here, but they did possess one critical advantage: the strategic brilliance of Themistocles. Themistocles' genius was born the son of a merchant. Had this occurred earlier in Greek history, Themistocles would have been confined to a lower social status. But democracy was emerging in Athens, allowing Themistocles to break free of his merchant class restrictions. Because of its natural, secure harbor, Athens developed a powerful seafaring tradition and quickly became both an economic powerhouse and a major naval force in the Aegean Sea. Many Athenian men, including Themistocles, became expert sailors, skilled at navigating the treacherous Greek coastlines. While Themistocles' naval training clearly shaped his future, it was his experience on land within the Athenian government where he learned some of his most invaluable lessons. What Themistocles learned growing up in a developing democracy was the intricate art of manipulation and political strategy. These were not the cutthroat politics found in, say, Rome, where opponents were literally assassinated. What Themistocles mastered was the use of his intelligence and cunning to strategically position himself within the government until he became profoundly influential. It was these political skills that would ultimately enable him to convince the Athenians to build the navy he would desperately need to challenge the mighty Persians. Around 490 BC, a decade before the final stand at Thermopylae, Athens possessed only about 100 warships. Themistocles knew this was just a fraction of the force the Persians could muster. He knew this because he had personally witnessed the Persian might up close at the Battle of Marathon. Themistocles had been one of the generals present at the Battle of Marathon, where he had seen Persian tactics firsthand. As an experienced military professional, he drew a different conclusion from Marathon than the other Greek generals. The other generals saw it as a glorious triumph of ground forces over the enemy. What Themistocles learned at Marathon was that you cannot effectively employ ground forces on the mainland unless you maintain naval support. Themistocles was certain that after their humiliating defeat at Marathon, the Persians would seek revenge and inevitably return to finish what they started. And he knew they would not repeat the same mistakes twice. He believed the Persians would come by both land and sea, bringing far more soldiers and many more ships. What Themistocles realized was the vital synergy between naval forces and land forces. Specifically, the Navy could only successfully support the ground troops as long as the coastline was friendly. The land forces, in turn, were essential to keep the coast friendly. Themistocles understood that the Persians could never sustain a massive army in mainland Greece if they were unable to resupply it effectively by sea. Therefore, if the Greeks could establish significant naval power and make themselves the dominant naval force in the Aegean Sea, they could render the entire Persian land army impotent. He concluded that the future of Athens depended not on increasing the size of her army, which was already respectable, but rather on substantially increasing the size of her navy. The difficulty Themistocles faced was that virtually no one believed his warnings. Both the Athenian military leaders and the general public suffered from an overconfidence in the Athenian army and a profound denial about Persia's eventual return. Themistocles lived every single day of his political life driven by the urgency that we must deal with this threat right now. We must prepare immediately. He pursued a couple of strategies that arguably saved the entire Greek world. First and foremost, he had to successfully persuade the Athenians that they needed to invest heavily in the navy. Perhaps more challenging, he had to secure the massive funding required to do it. He caught a lucky break in 483 BC, 3 years before the last stand at Thermopylae. In the Athenian mining district of Laurium, miners discovered a vast new vein of silver ore. Over the course of 1 year, they extracted nearly 2.5 tons of the precious metal from the earth. Themistocles desperately wanted the profit generated from this silver to be spent on his navy. The key challenge for him was convincing the Athenians that they needed more warships in their harbor, not more money in their personal pockets. Each Athenian citizen was entitled to receive 10 drachmas from the silver profits. That amount would be equivalent to about $1,500 to $1,600 in modern money. It was a substantial sum for the time. Because most Athenians were still in deep denial about a second Persian invasion, Themistocles shrewdly employed his political cunning to win them over. He essentially lied to them. Themistocles deliberately misled the Athenians into believing that a smaller rival island off the coast of Athens, called Aegina, posed a more immediate threat to the safety of Athenian merchant ships. Finally, convinced, the Athenians authorized Themistocles to invest the silver profit into the navy. Greek civilization may have been saved by a clever deception. What historians might categorize as a lie or an untruth, a sophisticated politician would term a clever misdirection of the populace to achieve a more critical, greater end. And that is precisely what Themistocles did. He knew that if he told the blunt truth, the public would never approve the spending. So he fabricated a convenient little ploy, a convenient cover story, and it worked perfectly. Themistocles got his ships. Athenian warships of the era were known as triremes. The trireme was a long vessel about 90 feet in length by approximately 18 feet wide. Most of the structure was likely built from pine wood, a common Mediterranean timber. The best analogy for a trireme is that it was a very light, swift boat, more akin to a racing shell. It was not a heavy vessel. Why the light construction? Because the sole objective was to ram the enemy, and the lighter the boat, the faster it could be propelled.
Built purely for maximum speed, the hull of the trireme was generally open. The deck consisted of just 1 or 2 planks of wood running lengthwise, upon which the ship's commander and about 4 Marines would stand. Despite carrying a small auxiliary sail, the trireme was primarily powered by between 170 and 220 oarsmen, arranged in 3 distinct banks of oars, one positioned above the other. The front of the trireme was shaped into a rounded prow. The prow was likely constructed from heavier cedar wood and covered with a brass or copper casing, specifically enabling the ship to ram and sink enemy vessels. The fastest speed a reconstructed trireme has ever achieved in a measured 2,000-meter test run is 15 knots. But even at that speed, it provided a fast, powerful pulse needed for a successful ramming attack. By the time the Persians reached Thermopylae and Artemisium a year later, the Greeks had successfully added over 100 new ships to their fleet. Still, the Persian fleet outnumbered the Greek fleet by an estimated ratio of nearly 6-to-1. Themistocles was about to find out whether his monumental efforts to build the Athenian navy had been in vain. In the Artemisium Strait, the Athenian commander Themistocles led nearly 200 Greek warships into battle. They were engaging a force of more than 800 Persian warships. Themistocles was employing the element of complete surprise. Late in the afternoon on the first day of the battle, he was deliberately attacking the vastly larger Persian fleet. It was an extremely high-risk move. If he failed and allowed the Persians to sail through the Artemisium Strait, Leonidas and the 300 Spartans would be immediately surrounded and cut to pieces. Using a flag signal to communicate with his fleet, Themistocles ordered all the Greek warships to slowly back into a narrower part of the strait, forming a tight circle formation. At a second, prearranged signal, the Greek fleet suddenly rushed outward from their formation and violently attacked the Persians. Greek naval battles were fundamentally not about troops getting off the ships and fighting each other, or even hooking the ships together for boarding actions. They were entirely focused on maneuvering the vessels in a way that allowed you to ram and sink the enemy. The most common tactic was to approach the enemy ship alongside and at an angle and smash off all of its oars. Because remember, these ships were not powered primarily by sails, they were entirely dependent on oars. So if you could successfully smash his oars, and as one ship came alongside the other, the attacking ship would pull in its oars, allowing the side of the vessel to smash in and run along the side of the enemy ship. That enemy was dead in the water. Therefore, in these decisive battles, what was truly important was not so much the weight or the size of your ship, but rather the sheer speed of your ship. In the confined space of Artemisium, the smaller, more agile Greek fleet inflicted significant damage upon several Persian ships. They also managed to capture 30 enemy vessels and took many prisoners. We are not entirely certain why the Greeks performed so exceptionally well on that first day at Artemisium. Both the Greeks and the Persians used the same fundamental type of vessel. Everyone had triremes, so neither side would have had an inherent speed advantage. Whatever the precise reason, it represented a huge psychological victory for the Greek navy. And because Themistocles had deliberately initiated his attack late in the day, he knew the battle could not last long, ensuring that his potential losses would remain minimal. This result must have been a complete surprise to everyone involved. The Persians certainly were not expecting to suffer losses against the smaller Greek fleet, and I don't believe the Greeks themselves expected to emerge so strongly. I think that is one of the main reasons why Themistocles started the engagement so late in the day. So you have Themistocles winning the battle at sea, and simultaneously Leonidas and the Spartans were winning the battle on land.
On this first day of fighting, Xerxes had been thoroughly shocked and publicly embarrassed by Themistocles and the Athenian navy, and had suffered the loss of nearly 10,000 infantrymen to Leonidas and the Spartans. Matthew Gonzalez. After the initial day's battles at Thermopylae and Artemisium, the Persians had been very roughly handled by the Greeks. They retreated back to their camp that evening, licking their wounds, and Xerxes was seriously contemplating what his next move would be. As darkness fell, a tremendous, violent storm erupted, and the Persian soldiers were further tormented by constant thunder, high winds, and torrential rain. So you must imagine the flashes of lightning intermittently illuminating the scattered shipwrecks on the sea and the piles of dead bodies on the beach. It was a profoundly disheartening night for the Persians. They likely did not get the quality of sleep they desperately needed for the following day's battle. The Persian fleet that had been sent on the flanking maneuver around the island of Euboea was caught directly in the path of the storm. The Aegean Sea mercilessly swallowed all 200 of those ships. It was an unmistakable and dire omen that the Persians could not ignore, and one that the Greeks happily welcomed. The next day was guaranteed to bring even more bloodshed. On the second day of the battle, the Athenians and Spartans returned to their respective defensive positions. Themistocles was in the Artemisium Strait, and Leonidas and the 300 Spartans were back in the Thermopylae Pass. They both prepared for the second major Persian assault. Matthew Gonzalez. The sun rose on the second day, and Xerxes declared, "Enough of these junior-level infantry attacks. We are sending in the heavy hitters." Xerxes committed the hammer and anvil of the Persian army, the silent and masked heavy infantry known as the Immortals. Guy MacLean Rogers. Xerxes decided to deploy the A-Team, his elite Immortals. He was convinced that once the Immortals were sent into action, it would instantly shatter the Greek resistance. Here came 10,000 men, marching in a perfect rectangular formation, advancing rhythmically, silently, directly toward the Greeks. No matter what happened, they kept advancing. The Greeks would not have known the exact size, but they wore a type of soft felt cap called a tiara on their heads. The tiara was a wrapped cloth, a very thin fabric that they could see through. 10,000 men strong. They were named the Immortals because when one man retired or was killed, he was immediately replaced by a fresh soldier, keeping the unit number constant. The armies stood roughly 50 yards apart in the Thermopylae Pass. The Persians were faceless and completely mute. But silence was never part of the Spartan psychological warfare strategy. Finally, the Persians advanced. Silently, the Immortals slammed into the Greek line. Just as on the previous day, the 300 Spartans and the allied Greek soldiers held their position rock solid. The Immortals' long spears could not penetrate the thick Greek armor. Conversely, the Greek spears had absolutely no difficulty finding their mark. The Persian shields were made only of flimsy wicker.
The answer was the Athenian navy. They were strategically positioned at Artemisium, while the Persians were based across the strait at Aphyte. The Persian objective was to breach the Greek line, sail south through the narrow 6-mile-wide Artemisium Strait, and land soldiers behind Leonidas and his Greek warriors, completely encircling them. The man entrusted with the vital task of stopping the massive Persian fleet was aboard the Athenian flagship. He is considered by many to be the tactical genius behind the combined land and sea defense against the Persians, and is widely regarded as one of the ancient world's most brilliant military strategists. He was the Athenian Themistocles. When most people recall the Battle of Thermopylae, they instantly think of the 300 Spartans or King Leonidas. But in reality, the unsung hero of the entire operation, the man who made the defense possible, was Themistocles. Themistocles, in many ways, served as the Winston Churchill of his generation. He was an astute Athenian politician with incredible foresight regarding the approaching conflict and a deep military thinker. He knew that the Persians were coming and that the Greeks were unprepared, but the Athenians simply did not believe him. The Persian navy attempted a complex maneuver to surround the smaller Greek fleet. They dispatched 200 of their 1,000 ships sailing southeast around the massive island of Euboea.
By sending ships around Euboea, the Persian naval commander was attempting to avoid wasting his resources on a direct frontal assault. He calculated that the Greeks were not foolish enough to attack him head-on, so he planned to wait at his base until his smaller flanking force sailed around the island and successfully surrounded the Greek fleet. But Themistocles executed a bold and audacious move that completely surprised the Persian commander. Late in the afternoon, the Greek fleet sailed out from their base and deliberately provoked the Persian fleet, which was nearly 6 times their size. This aggressive move astonished the Persian commander. It was one thing for Themistocles to possess the audacity to attack the mighty Persian navy, but he was also completely surprised by the timing of the attack. It was late in the afternoon. By starting the battle in the late afternoon, Themistocles knew the fighting would soon have to cease because they would run out of daylight. You simply cannot fight a complex naval battle effectively in the dark. Thus, Themistocles was aiming to minimize his potential losses should the battle turn against him by relying on nightfall to end the engagement. The Persian commander ordered his remaining 800 ships to advance into the strait. Despite the severe numerical disadvantage, Themistocles and the Greek fleet fiercely attacked the Persian ships, attempting to sink them in a ferocious assault. The central objective of the battle was to sink the enemy ship, either by ramming her squarely in the side or by smashing off all her oars and rendering her completely immobile. The Greeks certainly faced an immense uphill struggle here, but they did possess one critical advantage: the strategic brilliance of Themistocles. Themistocles' genius was born the son of a merchant. Had this occurred earlier in Greek history, Themistocles would have been confined to a lower social status. But democracy was emerging in Athens, allowing Themistocles to break free of his merchant class restrictions. Because of its natural, secure harbor, Athens developed a powerful seafaring tradition and quickly became both an economic powerhouse and a major naval force in the Aegean Sea. Many Athenian men, including Themistocles, became expert sailors, skilled at navigating the treacherous Greek coastlines. While Themistocles' naval training clearly shaped his future, it was his experience on land within the Athenian government where he learned some of his most invaluable lessons. What Themistocles learned growing up in a developing democracy was the intricate art of manipulation and political strategy. These were not the cutthroat politics found in, say, Rome, where opponents were literally assassinated. What Themistocles mastered was the use of his intelligence and cunning to strategically position himself within the government until he became profoundly influential. It was these political skills that would ultimately enable him to convince the Athenians to build the navy he would desperately need to challenge the mighty Persians. Around 490 BC, a decade before the final stand at Thermopylae, Athens possessed only about 100 warships. Themistocles knew this was just a fraction of the force the Persians could muster. He knew this because he had personally witnessed the Persian might up close at the Battle of Marathon. Themistocles had been one of the generals present at the Battle of Marathon, where he had seen Persian tactics firsthand. As an experienced military professional, he drew a different conclusion from Marathon than the other Greek generals. The other generals saw it as a glorious triumph of ground forces over the enemy. What Themistocles learned at Marathon was that you cannot effectively employ ground forces on the mainland unless you maintain naval support. Themistocles was certain that after their humiliating defeat at Marathon, the Persians would seek revenge and inevitably return to finish what they started. And he knew they would not repeat the same mistakes twice. He believed the Persians would come by both land and sea, bringing far more soldiers and many more ships. What Themistocles realized was the vital synergy between naval forces and land forces. Specifically, the Navy could only successfully support the ground troops as long as the coastline was friendly. The land forces, in turn, were essential to keep the coast friendly. Themistocles understood that the Persians could never sustain a massive army in mainland Greece if they were unable to resupply it effectively by sea.
Therefore, if the Greeks could establish significant naval power and make themselves the dominant naval force in the Aegean Sea, they could render the entire Persian land army impotent. He concluded that the future of Athens depended not on increasing the size of her army, which was already respectable, but rather on substantially increasing the size of her navy. The difficulty Themistocles faced was that virtually no one believed his warnings. Both the Athenian military leaders and the general public suffered from an overconfidence in the Athenian army and a profound denial about Persia's eventual return. Themistocles lived every single day of his political life driven by the urgency that we must deal with this threat right now. We must prepare immediately. He pursued a couple of strategies that arguably saved the entire Greek world. First and foremost, he had to successfully persuade the Athenians that they needed to invest heavily in the navy. Perhaps more challenging, he had to secure the massive funding required to do it. He caught a lucky break in 483 BC, 3 years before the last stand at Thermopylae. In the Athenian mining district of Laurium, miners discovered a vast new vein of silver ore. Over the course of 1 year, they extracted nearly 2.5 tons of the precious metal from the earth. Themistocles desperately wanted the profit generated from this silver to be spent on his navy. The key challenge for him was convincing the Athenians that they needed more warships in their harbor, not more money in their personal pockets. Each Athenian citizen was entitled to receive 10 drachmas from the silver profits. That amount would be equivalent to about $1,500 to $1,600 in modern money. It was a substantial sum for the time. Because most Athenians were still in deep denial about a second Persian invasion, Themistocles shrewdly employed his political cunning to win them over. He essentially lied to them. Themistocles deliberately misled the Athenians into believing that a smaller rival island off the coast of Athens, called Aegina, posed a more immediate threat to the safety of Athenian merchant ships. Finally, convinced, the Athenians authorized Themistocles to invest the silver profit into the navy. Greek civilization may have been saved by a clever deception. What historians might categorize as a lie or an untruth, a sophisticated politician would term a clever misdirection of the populace to achieve a more critical, greater end. And that is precisely what Themistocles did. He knew that if he told the blunt truth, the public would never approve the spending, so he fabricated a convenient little ploy, a convenient cover story, and it worked perfectly. Themistocles got his ships. Athenian warships of the era were known as triremes. The trireme was a long vessel about 90 feet in length by approximately 18 feet wide. Most of the structure was likely built from pine wood, a common Mediterranean timber. The best analogy for a trireme is that it was a very light, swift boat, more akin to a racing shell. It was not a heavy vessel. Why the light construction? Because the sole objective was to ram the enemy, and the lighter the boat, the faster it could be propelled.
The wicker shields worked well if you were merely trying to ward off javelins, dagger thrusts, or incoming arrows. But a wicker shield, when compared to the bronze shield of the Greeks, was no defense at all. The spear of the Greek infantry could easily pierce right through the wicker shield. So man for man, company for company, platoon for platoon, they were absolutely no match for the Spartans in close quarters combat. It is quite clear that the immortals had never before fought against a hoplite army as well trained, as heavily equipped, and as tactically flexible as the Spartans. After 2 full days of battle, thousands of Persians had been killed. If you can visualize an infantry line killing everything in front of it with spears, the bodies of the dead begin to pile up dramatically. After every single assault, there were dead men and men screaming in agony. Blood was staining the entire landscape, but mostly there were men obstructing the path. You had to clear the battlefield somewhere. So what would happen during one of the lulls in the fighting is that squads would move forward and physically drag the dead bodies out of the way. By the close of the second day, the Persian body count was enormous,
and their ground forces had once again been completely stalled. So looking at the tactics, after the first 2 days of fighting at Thermopylae, Leonidas would have felt he was in a very strong position. He had successfully weathered everything the Persians could throw at him, and he had suffered only minimal losses himself. Meanwhile, off the coast, Themistocles once again led the Athenian navy against the Persian fleet in the Artemisium Strait. The massive storm from the previous night had completely destroyed the Persian ships that were attempting to sail around Euboea. With no Persian ships advancing on his rear, Themistocles could focus his entire force on the front. However, he was still outnumbered 5-1. While the precise details of the second day's naval battle are largely unknown, the Greek triremes were again able to destroy many of the Persian warships. So by the end of the second day at sea, a very similar scenario had played out. The Persians had again tried to overwhelm Themistocles at sea, and they had not fared any better than the first day. The entire Greek front was holding, both at sea and on land. It was another immense psychological victory for the Greeks. Xerxes was growing increasingly frustrated, but the devastating solution to his problem would soon become tragically clear to the Persian king. This realization would lead directly to one of the most famous and profoundly heroic last stands in human history. 7,000 Greek soldiers, led by the Spartan king Leonidas and his elite group of 300 Spartan warriors, successfully blocked the narrow Thermopylae Pass in northeastern Greece. Their mission was to prevent the Persian army, the largest land force ever assembled, from completely destroying the Greek city-state of Athens. You are stuck in a situation where the cork is stuck firmly in the bottle, and you must find a way to get that cork out. Up until this point, they had attempted a light infantry attack and were severely beaten. They then followed up with their best troops, the heavy infantry immortals, and suffered just as badly. So the question was, what to do next? Things were becoming precarious. The immense army was stalled. It required daily feeding, consuming precious supplies rapidly, and was making zero progress. There was a desperate interest in finding any possible way around the Spartan position. Xerxes soon found his answer. A small, seldom-used trail led from the Persian camp, curved around Mount Kallidromos, and continued directly behind the Greek defensive line. Historians are divided on exactly when Xerxes became aware of this pass. Some believe that a Greek traitor had informed him after the second day of the battle. Seeing that he could not penetrate the fierce Greek defense, and knowing his vast food supply was rapidly dwindling, Xerxes made the decision to use the pass. What he did was at nightfall on the second day, after the heavy infantry attack had utterly failed in the center, he began, under the cover of darkness, to move 10,000 of his best troops up that mountain road to flank the Spartan position. But this hidden pass was not unknown to King Leonidas. Before the first day of the attack even began, Leonidas had stationed 1,000 men at the top of the pass to guard it. This critical force was composed of soldiers called the Phocians. But as the Persians approached the Phocian line, the defending force was gone. There is a critical intersection at the top of that ridge. One branch leads down to where the Phocian camp was. For some reason, the Phocian troops mistakenly believed that the attack was going to be on their homeland, and they completely withdrew their defense. Fearing their families and homes would be attacked, the Phocians retreated to defend their own territory. The Persians now had an unhindered, open path of destruction. At this moment, Leonidas and his men were utterly doomed. Above and behind them were 10,000 enemy infantrymen who could come scrambling down the hill at any moment to cut off their retreat. In the middle of the night, Greek scouts delivered the chilling news to Leonidas that the Phocians had deserted their post. Knowing that he had been completely outflanked, Leonidas gave the order for the majority of the Greek infantry to retreat. You cannot simply order 4,000 people to turn around and march away instantly. There are many reasons for this. First, the enemy immediately knows what you're doing and will launch a massive frontal attack. Second, you cannot wait until you're completely surrounded from the back. So what was the necessary action? You had to get relatively small units in a carefully phased withdrawal, hopefully quietly, so the enemy wouldn't realize that the front line had been drastically thinned. Otherwise, they would attack immediately. By the first light of dawn, almost all of the Greek troops had successfully retreated. All, that is, except for Leonidas, his 300 Spartans, and about 1,000 dedicated soldiers from the Greek city-state of Thespia. Very few people are aware of this crucial detail of the battle, but nearly 1,000 Thespians chose to remain behind with Leonidas. They had the option to leave, but they consciously decided to stay and fight alongside the Spartans to the bitter end. The reason this fact often gets overlooked is that the Battle of Thermopylae has been heavily mythologized throughout history and in modern films, often depicting only 300 Spartans facing millions of Persians. But that narrative is historically inaccurate. Still, this remaining force of just over 1,000 men was hopelessly surrounded by tens of thousands of Persians. Leonidas and his men were now about to execute their ultimate last stand. There was truly a poignant moment when the Spartans were marching forward to the front lines, ready to die, while their allies were marching back to safety, ready to live. That moment, to me, is in many ways the most emotionally powerful of the entire conflict. So the fundamental question remains, why did he do it? Why did Leonidas not simply retreat with his core group and live to fight another day? I believe there are a couple of compelling answers. Some will argue that he was simply fulfilling the dark prophecy of the oracle. Either your glorious city will fall to the sons of Persia, or all Sparta must grieve for the loss of a king. Leonidas believed the sacrifice was essential to save Sparta itself, and that is why he stayed and why he chose to engage in a quixotic battle that he absolutely knew he was destined to lose. It wasn't because he desired to be a martyr. It wasn't because, as a Spartan soldier, he was strictly trained to stand and die. Quite the opposite. As a Spartan soldier, he was meticulously trained to be stealthy, to steal, and to evade capture. But as a deeply religious Spartan, he believed implicitly in the oracles. As a Spartan, he believed deeply in his religion, and as a king of Sparta, it was his sacred duty to stand and die for the state. Leonidas's profound faith may have held him in the Thermopylae Pass, but viewed from a strict military perspective, he may have remained purely as a covering force during a critical tactical retreat. Delay for minutes, buy a chance for life. Every day he could delay the enemy, every minute he could hold up the advance, gave the Greeks retreating behind him a crucial opportunity to assemble their army and prepare a new defensive position. The soldiers who had pulled out of the pass still had a long distance to travel before they could link up with the main armies. So essentially, he made the deliberate decision to stand to the very last man to buy an extra day or two for the main army. In short, he transformed himself and his personal bodyguard into an essential covering force for a necessary strategic or tactical retreat.
Historians will never definitively know the precise reason why Leonidas decided to stay behind, but the heroic last stand of those 1,000+ men will be remembered forever. After 2 days of failed attempts to penetrate the Greek defenses at Thermopylae, the Persians had finally discovered a way to surround the pass. The Spartan king Leonidas had ordered a crucial tactical retreat of most of his fighting force. While only about 1,000 Greek troops remained, including the 300 Spartans, Leonidas was now completely trapped by tens of thousands of Persian soldiers. Leonidas was making his final stand in the Thermopylae Pass. For 2 days, he had successfully repelled the relentless Persian advances, but now the Persians had him cornered. They had finally figured out how to flank him, and they had him exactly where they wanted. Despite this dire knowledge, the Spartans calmly prepared for their final battle. A Persian scout watched their every move. David George, the Persian scout, observed the Spartans exercising completely in the nude and then pouring oil on themselves afterward, cleaning themselves meticulously and carefully arranging their long hair,
meticulously combing it out. The Persians witnessed this and simply could not understand. They saw vanity or mundane grooming behavior. They did not comprehend that the Spartans were solemnly preparing their bodies for the finality of death. Cleaned and completely prepared for the inevitable, the Spartans took the field one last defiant time. Richard Gabriel. These men were professional warriors to the core. This is how they defined their entire lives. This is how their status within society was earned and maintained. My estimation is that they would have welcomed this final ultimate battle in the same way that a man like Custer probably welcomed his final battle. They thought, we are vastly outnumbered, but we are unequivocally the superior fighters. They would have welcomed this battle from both a psychological and a social perspective. Herodotus describes the final brutal battle. On one side, the vast barbarian forces surrounding Xerxes were marching forward. On the other, the Greeks under Leonidas, fully realizing that they were about to leave this stage and die, advanced much further than they had on previous days, moving into the wider part of the pass. Indeed, knowing that death was imminent from the troops moving around the mountain, they unleashed all the strength they possessed against the barbarians and fought like absolute madmen, having no concern for anything except the present moment of combat. Richard Gabriel. We cannot be absolutely certain of the exact details of what happened during that final fight, but I am sure that after the Persians attacked from both the front and the rear, the Greeks' ranks broke and the formidable phalanx formation shattered. Because the phalanx was the very foundation of the Greek defense, once it fell apart, the remaining Spartans were nowhere near as strong or effective as they had been over the previous 2 days. David George. The battlefield would have instantly devolved into complete chaos at that point, becoming pretty much every man for himself. Many would likely have immediately switched to their short swords in such close quarters. Herodotus tells us that all of the Greek spears were eventually broken, and that they were forced to fight with anything they could find or wield. Herodotus makes special mention of the exceptional bravery and valor of a few of the Spartans by name. In addition to King Leonidas, there was his brave lieutenant Dionychus, who appears to have distinguished himself greatly during the final battle, Richard Gabriel. But despite their valiant efforts and the years of intense, brutal military training, it was only a matter of time before the soldiers of the Spartan warrior cult were systematically slaughtered. And indeed, it seems the oracle's cryptic message to Leonidas was tragically about to be fulfilled. Herodotus records that at some point early in the final battle, Leonidas was struck by the relentless Persian arrow fire. One can only imagine the great king lying mortally wounded and watching his Spartan brethren fall, one by one, around him. Leonidas perished in this epic fight, having proved himself a man of immense quality, like the legendary heroes of old. A desperate great battle then erupted over the body of Leonidas. 4 times the Greeks successfully repelled the enemy and finally managed to recover the body through sheer valor. Herodotus writes that Dionychus rescued his king's body and with the few remaining Spartan soldiers retreated to a final, much narrower part of the pass. The Persians called out their archers for one final devastating barrage. They were easily able to find their targets. Every single Spartan was slaughtered. After the massacre was complete, Xerxes personally walked the blood-soaked battlefield. He had lost almost 20,000 men in 3 days. He immediately ordered his remaining soldiers to bury his dead, so that the rest of his army would not be demoralized by the horrific sight of so many rotting corpses. Xerxes also gave the brutal order for the head of Leonidas to be severed and affixed to a stake for public display. Richard Gabriel. In the face of this catastrophe, what lasting good can be found? The answer is the heroic death of men who successfully held the line so that their comrades might live, buying precious time for their country. It is a profoundly great, heroic story. It is exactly the kind of event that a culture will choose to remember, in the same way that we, in our culture, tend to remember those men and women who fall while performing an act of heroic sacrifice and earn the Medal of Honor. We hold their memory as a shining example to the next generation. If this worst-case scenario ever happens to you, this is the ideal behavior we expect you to exhibit. The Greeks did precisely the same thing. Xerxes now had a completely open path ahead of him. The Greek city-state of Athens was seemingly doomed. Leonidas and the 300 Spartans were dead. There was nothing left physically standing between the Persian king Xerxes and the city of Athens. Richard Gabriel. He marched his immense force straight through the pass of Thermopylae, effectively scattering any remaining Greek forces before him. Some of the Greek city-states that had previously been allied with Athens immediately switched their allegiance to the Persians out of pure self-interest. Off the coast at Artemisium, Themistocles again managed to hold off the Persian fleet, but this time he suffered significant casualties and lost some of his ships. But because of the devastating collapse of the Greek land defense, there was no longer any strategic reason for Themistocles to remain and defend the strait. He led the surviving fleet south to regroup and prepare to fight another day. Knowing that the burning of Athens, the very cradle of democracy, was inevitable, the Athenians had previously visited the oracle at Delphi seeking urgent guidance. Oracle, why do you remain seated, you who anxiously await impending doom? Flee immediately to the furthest parts of the earth. Zeus, the all-seeing, grants to you a wooden wall. This wall alone shall be indestructible, a lasting benefit to you and your children. As is common with all oracles, the true meaning was cryptic and difficult to interpret. Many Athenians believed that the oracle was telling them to remain sheltered behind the ancient walls of the Acropolis. But Themistocles firmly believed that the wooden walls referred to the ships of the navy, and that the entire city should be completely evacuated. 2 months after the heroic last stand at Thermopylae, Xerxes fulfilled his sacred promise to avenge the burning of the Ionian capital Sardis and the humiliating loss at Marathon. It had taken 20 long years, 2 major cross-continental invasions, and the loss of tens of thousands of lives, but Xerxes finally burned Athens to the ground. However, a great loss of civilian life was successfully averted. The only fatalities were those few who stubbornly refused to abandon their temples and their gods on the Acropolis. Only a handful of people stayed behind. Xerxes razed every building on top of the Acropolis to the ground, including the most sacred temples of the Athenians. This act was his deliberate and brutal payback for the destruction of Sardis.
1 month after Xerxes destroyed Athens, the Greeks enacted their own brutal revenge. Themistocles successfully lured the Persian king into the narrow strait of Salamis, where many of the Athenians had fled, and where his revitalized navy lay in ambush. While scholars still debate the exact details, it appears that a Greek double agent deliberately fed false information to the Persians about the Greek position. The Persians sailed confidently into the Strait of Salamis and were completely surprised and broadsided by the waiting Greek fleet. Themistocles annihilated a significant portion of the Persian navy. The naval battle at Salamis is likely the most important strategic moment of this entire Persian and Greek conflict. Yes, the Persians had defeated the Greeks at Thermopylae, and yes, they had burned Athens to the ground, but the Greek navy inflicted such massive, irreparable damage to the Persian fleet at Salamis that Xerxes was forced to withdraw the majority of his army. Eventually, he had no choice but to sail home, and without enough warships to successfully defend his vital transport ships, his entire position was doomed. Xerxes departed Greece and never returned. Many historians believe this crushing defeat marked the irreversible beginning of the end for the Persian Empire, because the Greeks became emboldened and began attacking the Persians on their own home soil. The Greeks went on to score major military victories against the Persians at Plataea, Mycale, and Sestos. The Greeks relentlessly chased the Persians back to Asia, and they finally burned that colossal pontoon bridge that had been built across the Hellespont.
They watched it burn down into the Aegean Sea. But before they burned it, they carefully removed those special cables, the ones made of flaxen and papyrus that had tethered the ships together, and kept them as cherished war trophies. In fact, the Athenians so highly prized these cables as trophies that they prominently displayed them in their newly reconstructed Parthenon. The ability of the various Greek city-states, like Athens and Sparta, to put aside their deep internal differences was what ultimately enabled them to join forces and successfully battle Persia as a unified country. This vital strategy was one they had first reluctantly employed at the pass of Thermopylae. Richard Gabriel, sometimes we fail to fully appreciate the true importance of Thermopylae. Perhaps not its tactical military significance, but its immense symbolic and cultural importance. Greece was in the process of becoming something it had never been before. It was transitioning from being a chaotic hodgepodge of small, warring city-states into a single nation that possessed a shared identity, a sense of being Greek first, more than Athenian, more than Spartan. It began to identify its core values and culture not as separate city-states, but as one unified nation, as a whole. Ultimately, Philip of Macedon would take this concept a step further and unify the Greek city-states into one single country. With this unified nation behind him, Philip's son, Alexander the Great, would go on to completely destroy the Persian Empire and spread Greek culture throughout the world, introducing the vanquished peoples to Greek politics, their system of law, their literature, their philosophy, and their art. And the Hellenistic culture that Alexander spread became the fundamental basis of our modern Western civilization. All of that success would have been utterly impossible, completely impossible, had Greece remained nothing more than a collection of separate, squabbling city-states. But it had evolved into one nation, driven by a powerful sense of nationalism. And that vital sense of nationalism began at one singular, crucial location, and that place was the pass of Thermopylae. It was a heroic last stand for Leonidas and the 300 Spartans, soldiers who deliberately remained behind and fought to the death while their Greek comrades escaped to survive and fight another day. Wars are fundamentally won by shattering the enemy's will to continue fighting. And at Thermopylae, Leonidas and the Spartans began the process of breaking the Persians' will. It would take another 150 years, but the enduring memory and legend of the 300 Spartans would eventually spur the Greeks to final, decisive victory over the Persians. Had the Persians emerged victorious, the concept of democracy would have been immediately terminated. And I believe it is truly inconceivable that democracy would have spontaneously arisen anywhere else, either in the Near East or the rest of the Greek world. That would have been the absolute end of democracy as we know it. For centuries, military scholars have studied the Spartans' last stand, where a few stood against the many, and death was considered the ultimate noble sacrifice. While many still admire and cherish the Spartan heroism and bravery, what is perhaps far more important is the profound impact the battle had on the birth and trajectory of Western civilization and the entire world.